It was New Year's Eve, 2024, and I was spending the night at my cousin's new house in rural Pennsylvania. He had just bought the place a few months earlier and was throwing a party to celebrate both the new year and his new home. The house was a fixer-upper, an old farmhouse that sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road surrounded by thick woods. It was charming in a rustic way, but also isolated, perfect for a party that wouldn't disturb the neighbors. By 11 p.m., the house was buzzing with energy. People were laughing, music was playing, and drinks were flowing. I stayed mostly in the living room, chatting with friends and keeping an eye on my cousin's dog, Daisy, a skittish golden retriever who seemed overwhelmed by all the noise. Every now and then, she'd pace around the room, her ears perked up like she was listening for something no one else could hear. As midnight approached, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the clear night sky was dotted with stars. The woods around the property were eerily silent, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shook off the thought and lit a cigarette, enjoying the brief solitude. That's when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a branch swaying in the wind or maybe a woodpecker, but the sound was too deliberate, too measured. It stopped for a moment, then started again, louder this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. There was no response, just the tapping. I squinted into the darkness, but the flashlight on my phone barely cut through the thick shadows. Suddenly, Daisy came bounding out of the house, barking furiously. She stopped a few feet in front of me, her eyes fixed on the woods, her hackles raised. I'd never seen her act that way before. She was normally timid and sweet. Her growl sent a chill down my spine. "Come on, girl," I said, my voice shaking. "Let's go back inside." As I reached for her collar, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and lanky, standing just at the tree line. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could see the outline of a head and shoulders, motionless except for the slight swaying of their body. "Hey!" I shouted, adrenaline surging. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the woods. Daisy whimpered and pressed herself against my leg, trembling. I backed toward the house, keeping my eyes on the tree line, but nothing else moved. Inside, the party was still in full swing. I tried to shake off the encounter, convincing myself it was probably just some local messing around, but Daisy wouldn't leave my side. Her behavior was unsettling. She kept pacing between me and the windows, growling softly. At midnight, everyone gathered in the living room to count down to the new year. The energy was high, and for a moment, I forgot about what I'd seen outside. But as the clock struck 12 and everyone cheered, the lights in the house flickered, then went out completely. There was a moment of stunned silence before someone laughed nervously and pulled out their phone for light. My cousin joked about the old wiring and went to check the breaker box in the basement. People started using their phones to light candles and flashlights, turning the house into a dim, flickering maze of shadows. I stayed in the living room, trying to calm Daisy, who was now growling at the front door. Her behavior was starting to unnerve the others, and my cousin's girlfriend suggested putting her in a bedroom to calm down. Before we could, there was a loud knock at the door. 3 sharp, deliberate raps that echoed through the silent house. Everyone froze. My cousin's voice called out from the basement, "Someone get that." I hesitated, but when no one else moved, I made my way to the door. Daisy barked and lunged, stopping just short of the threshold. I peered through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. "Seriously, this isn't funny," I said, my voice trembling. Still no response. I turned to the others, but everyone just stared, their faces pale in the candlelight. Finally, my cousin came back upstairs, annoyed. "What's the holdup?" he asked, brushing past me to open the door. The porch was empty. He stepped outside, shining his flashlight around, but there was no sign of anyone. The snow on the porch was undisturbed, no footprints, nothing. "Probably some kids messing around," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the mood had shifted. People started leaving shortly after, and by 2 a.m., the house was quiet again. My cousin and I stayed up, cleaning and talking about the strange events, but we didn't have any answers. The next morning, I found Daisy sitting by the front door, staring intently at the porch. When I opened the door to let her out, she froze, growling low in her throat. That's when I saw it, a single, long scratch on the wooden door, as if someone had dragged their fingernail across it. I moved back to the city not long after that, but my cousin still lives in that house. Every New Year's Eve, he calls me to joke about the ghostly visitor and whether it'll come back. But the way his voice falters at the end of the call tells me he's not joking at all. It was New Year's Eve 2024, and I was on the road heading to a party at my best friend Eric's cabin, deep in the woods of upstate New York. The storm that had been forecasted for days finally hit, but I figured I could make it there before it got too bad. I'd driven those roads plenty of times and thought I knew them well enough, even in the snow. The roads were deserted, and the snow was falling so heavily that it felt like driving through a tunnel. My headlights barely cut through the white haze, and the GPS kept losing signal. About halfway there, the car's gas light pinged on. I cursed myself for not filling up earlier, but there was a small gas station I remembered passing on the way up. I turned around and drove back until the faint neon glow of the station came into view. The place was desolate, the kind of spot that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The sign above the pump was faded, and the single flickering light above the station cast long, eerie shadows. I pulled up to the pump, only to see a handwritten sign taped to it, "Prepay inside." I groaned but grabbed my wallet and stepped out of the car, bracing against the biting wind. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the warmth inside was a welcome relief. The store was cramped and dimly lit, with shelves stocked with dusty cans and faded packages. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face lined and his eyes sharp, watching me without saying a word. "Just need to fill up," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond right away, just nodded slowly and rang me up. His hands shook slightly as he handed me my receipt. "You heading far?" he finally asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Just to a friend's cabin up the road," I replied, trying to keep it brief. The old man hesitated, his gaze lingering on me. "Storm's getting worse," he said. "Better to turn back while you can." I forced a smile and nodded, not wanting to be rude, but I had no intention of taking his advice. As I stepped back outside, the wind whipped snow into my face, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the edge of the woods. I froze, staring into the swirling snow, but when I looked again, there was nothing. Shaking it off, I filled the tank as quickly as I could and jumped back into the car. The warmth of the heater calmed my nerves as I drove back toward Eric's cabin. The snow seemed to fall even harder, and I had to slow to a crawl to avoid skidding off the narrow, unpaved road. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A woman, barefoot and wearing only a thin dress, her hair matted with snow. She stood motionless, staring directly at my car. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the icy road. My heart was racing as I rolled down the window just enough to call out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond, didn't move, just kept staring. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her lips were blue. Every instinct told me to stay in the car, but I couldn't just leave her there. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the cold. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I asked, keeping a cautious distance. She finally moved, turning slowly to face the woods. Without a word, she walked into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. "Wait," I shouted, following her with the flashlight. The beam barely penetrated the dense forest, and the snow quickly soaked through my boots and jacket. I called out again, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd vanished. I stumbled back to the car, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. As soon as the engine roared to life, the headlights illuminated the road ahead, and there she was, standing in the same spot, staring at me. Panic took over. I threw the car into reverse, the tires spinning before catching on the icy road. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my breath coming in short gasps. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat. It was Eric, asking if I was close. I considered turning back, but the thought of driving past that spot again made my stomach churn. I texted Eric that I was stuck in the storm and couldn't make it, then drove straight home, my hands gripping the wheel tightly the entire way. For days after, I couldn't shake the image of the woman in the snow. I searched local news sites, thinking maybe she'd been reported missing or found, but there was nothing. No reports, no sightings, nothing. Now, whenever I drive that road, I can't help but glance at the spot where I saw her. I haven't told anyone else about that night, partly because I'm not sure they'd believe me. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't just a lost traveler. Whatever she was, she didn't belong there, or anywhere else. It was New Year's Eve, 2024, and I had agreed to spend the evening house-sitting for my uncle, Greg. He owned a sprawling, older home on the outskirts of Spokane, Washington, and had left town for a weekend getaway with his wife. The job was simple: keep an eye on the place, feed the cat, and ensure nothing froze in the bitter cold. It seemed like an easy gig, especially since I'd be making some extra cash. Greg's house was nestled on a quiet street surrounded by tall pines, the kind of place that felt isolated even though it wasn't far from town. Snow covered everything in sight, the ground sparkling in the pale moonlight. I arrived around 6 p.m., carrying a duffel bag and some snacks to keep me entertained until midnight. The cat, an aloof Maine Coon named Jasper, greeted me with indifference before disappearing into another room. The house was old but beautifully maintained, with creaky hardwood floors and a large stone fireplace that gave it a cozy feel. I settled into the living room with a book and a mug of tea, enjoying the warmth of the fire. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, the wind howling against the windows. It was the kind of night that made you grateful to be indoors. Around 9 p.m., I heard a faint knock at the front door. At first, I thought I imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I set my book down and walked to the door, peering through the peephole. A woman stood there, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, her face partially obscured. Her gloved hands clutched a small bag. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, hesitant to open it for a stranger so late at night. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice muffled by the wind. "My car broke down a few streets over, and my phone's dead. Could I use yours to call for a tow?" Her story seemed plausible enough, but something about her demeanor felt off. She wasn't shivering or showing any signs of being cold, despite the freezing temperature. Still, I didn't want to leave her stranded. "There's a gas station about a mile down the road," I suggested, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. Her smile faltered. "Please," she said, her tone more insistent. "I won't take long." Against my better judgment, I opened the door just wide enough to hand her my phone. She thanked me and stepped back, dialing quickly. As she spoke, I noticed something strange. Her bag was dripping, leaving small puddles on the porch. When I looked closer, the liquid wasn't water. It was thick and dark, like oil or blood. Before I could ask about it, she handed the phone back, thanking me again. She said her friend was on the way and walked off into the snow. I shut the door and locked it, the uneasy feeling lingering long after she'd gone. Jasper padded into the room and hissed at the door, his fur standing on end. The night continued uneventfully until just after midnight. I was tidying up the kitchen when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. The sudden silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the circuit breaker in the garage, but everything seemed fine. Figuring the storm had knocked out the power, I lit a few candles and settled back into the living room. That's when I heard it, footsteps on the porch. They were slow and deliberate, crunching in the snow. My stomach tightened as I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. The porch was empty, but the footsteps continued, now circling the house. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. Panicking, I called my uncle to let him know what was happening, but the call wouldn't go through. The storm must have taken out the cell towers. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy, too purposeful. Suddenly, Jasper let out a guttural growl, his eyes fixed on the back door. I turned the flashlight in that direction and saw the handle slowly turning. Heart pounding, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a fireplace poker, and moved toward the door. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The handle stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the snow. I locked the back door and checked every window and entrance to make sure they were secure. As I passed by the front door, I noticed the puddle from the woman's bag was still there, but now it seemed larger, as if it had spread on its own. I barely slept that night, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, and the world outside was calm and pristine. I ventured onto the porch to look for tracks, but the snow was undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. I told Greg about the night's events when he returned, but he brushed it off, saying the storm probably played tricks on my senses. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with that house, or with the woman who had knocked on the door. Even now, I avoid house-sitting for others, especially during storms. Sometimes, when the wind howls late at night, I think about those footsteps and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the doors in time. New Year's Eve, 2024, started like any other. I had just moved to Colorado a few months prior and was still settling into my new apartment. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom in an older building on the edge of a small town, but it was quiet and cheap, which was all I needed. Since I didn't know many people in the area yet, I planned to stay home, watch a movie, and maybe video call some friends to ring in the new year. The snowstorm outside was relentless. Thick flakes fell steadily, blanketing the streets and muffling the usual sounds of the neighborhood. By 9 p.m., the world outside my window was nearly invisible, just a swirling sea of white. It was oddly peaceful, the kind of night that made you grateful to be indoors. I was halfway through a movie when the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and for a moment, I just sat there, letting my eyes adjust. I grabbed my phone for light and cursed when I saw it was only at 20%. I had been meaning to charge it, but had gotten distracted. The building's emergency lights kicked on in the hallway, casting an eerie red glow under my apartment door. I decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement, hoping the power outage was just a local issue. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I bundled up and stepped into the hallway. The building was silent, save for the faint hum of the emergency lights. I knocked on my neighbor's door to see if they had power, but no one answered. That wasn't unusual. Most of my neighbors were either older or kept to themselves. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder. The basement was a maze of narrow hallways and storage units, dimly lit by flickering emergency bulbs. I found the circuit breaker panel and shone my flashlight on it, but everything seemed fine. Frustrated, I figured it must be an issue with the town's power grid and decided to head back upstairs. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the sound of my boots crunching on the concrete floor, but it was there. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the direction of the noise. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing. No response. I told myself it was probably just the storm causing something outside to rattle. But as I turned to leave, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from one of the storage units. My pulse quickened as I approached, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The door to the storage unit was slightly ajar, the padlock hanging loose. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open with my foot, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with old boxes and furniture covered in dusty sheets. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then, my flashlight caught movement, a shadow darting behind a stack of boxes. My breath caught in my throat. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the tapping resumed, this time coming from just behind the stack. I took a step closer, heart pounding, and reached out to move one of the boxes. That's when I heard a low, guttural whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Leave." I dropped the flashlight in shock, the beam spinning wildly across the room. Scrambling to pick it up, I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose piece of wood. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight rolling out of reach. In the chaos, I saw something, a figure pale and gaunt, crouched in the shadows. Its eyes glinted in the faint light, wide and unblinking. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring about the noise I made or whether the thing in the storage unit followed. I sprinted up the stairs, slammed the door to the basement behind me, and locked it with trembling hands. Back in my apartment, I bolted the door and pushed a chair under the handle for good measure. My phone was down to 10%, but I managed to call the building's landlord. He sounded annoyed, saying he'd send someone to check it out in the morning, but his tone changed when I mentioned the storage unit. "There shouldn't be anything down there," he said. "All those units are empty. We've been clearing them out for months." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and gust of wind outside made me jump, and I kept checking the hallway through the peephole. The emergency lights cast unsettling shadows, making the already eerie corridor feel even more sinister. The next morning, the landlord called to tell me the power was back on, but he didn't mention the basement. I didn't ask. I just packed a bag, drove to the nearest hotel, and stayed there for the rest of the weekend. When I returned to the apartment a few days later, I avoided the basement entirely, but every now and then, I hear faint tapping at night, coming from below. I've convinced myself it's just the building settling, but a part of me knows better. On December 31st, 2024, I was driving from my parents' house in Vermont to my sister's home in New Hampshire to celebrate New Year's Eve. It was supposed to be a short, relaxing drive, but a heavy snowstorm swept in without warning. The roads were slick, visibility was awful, and my GPS kept glitching. Around 7 p.m., I missed a turn and ended up on a narrow, unlit road surrounded by dense forest. The snow was coming down so hard that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. My car's tires slipped and skidded as I tried to make sense of the GPS directions. After several minutes of driving in what felt like circles, I saw the faint glow of a house in the distance. Relieved, I decided to stop and ask for directions. The house was small and old, with its porch light flickering against the storm. I parked in the driveway and jogged to the front door, my boots crunching on the icy ground. As I raised my hand to knock, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 50s. He had a weathered face and piercing blue eyes that seemed to study me for a moment before he smiled. "Lost in the storm, are you?" he asked, his voice raspy but kind. I nodded, explaining my situation. He invited me inside to warm up and offered to look at a map to help me find my way. The interior of the house was dated but cozy, with a roaring fire in the hearth. A woman, presumably his wife, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. She was cheerful and offered me a cup of coffee, which I gladly accepted. We chatted for a while, and they told me their names were Hank and Marjorie. They said they'd lived in the area their whole lives and rarely had visitors. When I mentioned my sister's town, Hank's brow furrowed. "You're way off course," he said. "You'll have to backtrack a bit, but it's tricky in weather like this. Why don't you wait here until the storm lets up?" I hesitated. The house was warm, and the couple seemed friendly enough, but something about their demeanor made me uneasy. I thanked them for their hospitality, but said I'd rather keep moving. Hank insisted on walking me to my car, which I appreciated, given how slick the driveway had become. As we stepped outside, I noticed something odd. Despite the snow covering everything in sight, there were no tire tracks leading to the house, just my own. I glanced at Hank, but he didn't seem to notice my unease. Once I got back into the car, I waved goodbye and followed the directions Hank had given me. The storm had eased slightly, and I felt a bit more confident about finding my way. About 10 minutes later, I spotted headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I was relieved, thinking it was another car braving the storm. But as the headlights grew closer, they began to swerve erratically, almost as if the driver was trying to run me off the road. Panic set in as the car got closer and closer. I sped up, but the icy roads made it impossible to go fast. The other vehicle's headlights flashed aggressively, and I could hear the blaring of a horn behind me. Desperate, I turned down another narrow road, hoping to lose them, but the car followed. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, the road opened up to a small clearing with another house. I skidded to a stop and bolted out of my car, running to the front door. I pounded on it, shouting for help. The door opened, and to my shock, Hank and Marjorie were standing there. "What are you doing here?" I gasped, out of breath. Hank's friendly smile had vanished. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something else, something colder. "You never left," he said. "You've been here the whole time." I spun around, expecting to see the car that had been chasing me, but the driveway was empty. No headlights, no tracks, nothing. My car was still parked where I had left it, engine off, covered in snow. The couple ushered me inside, and I let them, too shaken to argue. I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't seem to understand, or didn't want to. Marjorie handed me another cup of coffee and insisted I sit by the fire. As I stared into the flames, trying to piece everything together, I realized something else. The clock on the mantel hadn't moved since I'd first arrived. It still read 7:15. My heart raced as I stood up and said I needed to leave. Hank blocked the door, his piercing blue eyes now filled with something predatory. "Stay a while," he said, his voice low. "The storm's not safe." I shoved past him and ran to my car, not caring about the ice or the cold. The engine sputtered but finally roared to life, and I sped away, ignoring the patches of ice and the risk of skidding. In my rearview mirror, I saw Hank and Marjorie standing on the porch, watching me. Their figures faded into the storm as I drove. I made it to my sister's house hours later, shaken but alive. When I told her what had happened, she looked at me like I was crazy. She said there were no houses along the road I described, just miles of forest. I don't know who or what Hank and Marjorie were, but I'll never forget their faces or the way time seemed to stand still in that house. I've stayed off back roads ever since, especially during snowstorms. Some places, I've learned, are better left undiscovered. It was December 31st, New Year's Eve, and I had agreed to watch my coworker Jared's dog, Luna, while he went out of town for the weekend. I'm 34 and past the phase of going out and partying hard for New Year's, so it seemed like an easy way to earn some extra cash. Jared, who's 26, lives in a quiet neighborhood about 40 minutes from my place. He gave me the keys to his 2-story home and left simple instructions. Feed Luna twice a day, take her on walks, and keep her off the couch. Luna is a small German shepherd mix with a calm demeanor, so I expected it to be an uneventful weekend. I arrived at Jared's house around 4 p.m. I brought along a duffel bag with clothes, toiletries, and my laptop, planning to relax while binging some shows. Jared's house was cozy and modern, with large windows facing the snowy woods behind the property. As the sun set, I made myself comfortable on the couch, Luna snoozing on the rug nearby. It was about 8:30 p.m. when the doorbell rang. Startled, I walked to the door and opened it to find a woman in her early 30s standing there. She wore a thick coat and scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She introduced herself as Sophie, Jared's girlfriend, and explained that she needed to grab something she'd left in his room. I wasn't sure if Jared had a girlfriend, but I didn't think much of it. She seemed polite, so I stepped aside to let her in. Sophie went upstairs, and Luna, uncharacteristically, sat up and growled softly. I texted Jared to confirm if Sophie was indeed his girlfriend, but he didn't respond right away. When Sophie came back down with a scarf in her hands, I casually asked how long she and Jared had been together. She chuckled nervously, saying, "Too long," before leaving. Something about the interaction unsettled me, but I dismissed it as awkwardness. Minutes later, Jared called me back, his voice confused. "What are you talking about?" "I don't have a girlfriend named Sophie," he said. My stomach sank as I realized I had just let a stranger into his home. Jared urged me to check his bedroom for missing items. I rushed upstairs and quickly scanned the room. Everything appeared to be in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the time I got back downstairs, the eerie quiet of the house felt suffocating. Luna was pacing near the front door, her tail low, her eyes locked on something outside. I looked through the peephole but saw only darkness and falling snow. At around 11 p.m., the atmosphere grew heavier. I was sitting on the couch when Luna started barking furiously at the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached. The snow-covered deck was empty, but faint footprints led into the woods. I decided to lock every door and window and stay on high alert until morning. At midnight, I texted Jared again, asking if he'd had any strange encounters before, but he didn't reply. Suddenly, Luna let out a deep growl and bolted toward the stairs. Her barking echoed as I followed her to the second floor. That's when I heard it, a faint creaking noise coming from the guest room at the end of the hall. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. Gathering my courage, I stepped inside the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but as I turned to leave, I noticed a corner of the window pane was slightly ajar. Snowflakes had drifted in, melting on the hardwood floor. I locked the window and shut the curtains, my heart pounding. As I returned to the living room, I heard the faint sound of laughter outside. Low, chilling, and unmistakably human. It was coming from the woods. Luna pressed herself against my legs, trembling. I peeked through the curtains and saw two figures standing at the edge of the tree line, barely illuminated by the porch light. I called the police, explaining that I believed someone had broken in earlier and might still be on the property. The operator assured me an officer would arrive shortly. I sat on the couch with Luna, clutching a kitchen knife, every sound amplified in the quiet. The officers arrived within 20 minutes, but by then, the figures were gone. They searched the house and the surrounding property, but found no sign of forced entry or anyone lingering nearby. I told them about Sophie, and one of the officers noted her description but said it was likely unrelated. Jared returned the next day, furious but understanding. He planned to change the locks immediately and set up a security system. To this day, he insists he doesn't know anyone named Sophie, and we never figured out who she was or what she had taken or left behind. I've dog-sat for friends since then, but I refuse to stay overnight. Something about that night haunts me, especially the sound of that laughter fading into the woods.